This presentation looks at inflation. Inflation is the sustained increase in national price levels. It's measured through the Consumer Price Index, which tracks changes in the price of a basket of goods over a period of time. The basket of goods is a bit of a complex concept, so let me give you an example. Let's say a population spends half of its money on housing and half of its money on food. Obviously, in real life, it's much more complex. But let's say over a 1-year period of time, food saw a 4% increase in price and housing saw a 2% increase in price. Well, since food and housing each make up 50% of the basket of goods, half of that basket of goods went up 4%, half of it went up 2%. Overall inflation would be 3%, and that would be reflected in the Consumer Price Index. Inflation that occurs at a small and steady rate is acceptable because we consider it to be an indicator of growth, which we'll discuss later. It also is helpful because debtors will be able to pay back long-term loans easier. So let's say you get a 20-year mortgage and you're paying $1,000 a month on that mortgage. Well, that rate is fixed. So at the end of that 20-year loan, the last few years, you're still going to be paying $1,000 a month. But because of inflation, $1,000 in the beginning of that may have seemed very burdensome, but now at the end, it's not so burdensome. Your income probably went up to compete with inflation, and $1,000 is not what it once was. So it actually helps you as a debtor. Unfortunately, inflation comes with some negatives too. The most obvious one is a loss of purchasing power. So if you have $100 in your pocket right now, and over the course of a year, there's a 5% inflation, a year from now, if there was a $100 item that you could have bought now with your $100, it's going to be worth $105. You won't be able to afford it with that same $100, thus the loss of purchasing power. There's also economic uncertainty. When you don't know in the long run what your money is going to be worth, you might be a little hesitant to make some decisions that overall might lead to success, but you're trying to be safe. It also discourages savings. Going back to that $100 example, if you can put $100 in the bank and get 2% interest over a year, so you put $100 in, you get $102 out after a year. If over that same period of time, inflation is again 5%, then when you put that money in, you could have bought an item for $100. At the end of that year, that item is now worth $105. So if you were to have saved over that year, you start with $100, you end with $102. But over that same year, items became more expensive. What used to cost $100 now costs $105. What once was affordable is not affordable. Seems a little silly when we're talking about just $100, but make that something like $1 million, and the difference over 1 year due to inflation is substantial. And then finally, exports are less competitive. When you have inflation, it makes it so your goods seem more expensive than they once were, so people may not buy your goods overseas, and that's going to hurt your X minus M factor of GDP. Finally, not really a problem of inflation, but important to note, inflation is difficult to measure. It varies from person to person. My consumption habits are different than yours, and so while inflation might be 3% over a given year, how it affects me is different than how it affects you. It also varies geographically. That goes back to varying person to person, but how spending habits are in northern United States is going to be different than someone in southern United States, someone in western United States versus eastern. Heck, also between country to country, between United States and South Africa and China, we all have different spending habits. Two other terms that are very important when we talk about inflation is deflation. Deflation is the sustained decrease in national price levels. It's the opposite of inflation. Usually we don't like it because we think it is an indicator of an economic downturn. And in turn, when you have an economic downturn, you also get unemployment. Also, deflation makes it very challenging to pay back loans, the opposite of inflation. I just explained how over a long period of time, inflation is good. It makes long-term loans seem more bearable, especially towards the end of the loan payback term. But if people have challenges paying back their loans, then banks might not get the money they need, and that can lead to bankruptcy. Finally, disinflation. That's a falling rate of inflation. It is not the same as deflation. Simple example to illustrate the point. If inflation goes from 2% to 1% over the course of a year, then disinflation has occurred. We see a falling rate of inflation. However, there still is inflation. We're still talking about a positive growth in the national price levels. So disinflation is just a falling rate. You could disinflate so much that it pushes you into deflation, but disinflation does not guarantee deflation. Two different terms, fairly easy to separate once you understand the difference. So let's talk about the two major types of inflation. The first is demand pull. Demand pull is caused by an increase in aggregate demand, thus the name demand pull. Some examples of what would lead to an increase in AD: maybe consumption goes up because income increases as wages increase, or maybe taxes are decreased. Maybe investment increase because interest rates are lower, and that makes loans cheaper, so firms are more eager to invest. Or maybe government spending goes up simply because the government budget allows for more spending, and that pumps more money into the economy. These are just some examples, not the only reasons that AD would go up. But in short, demand pull inflation is caused by economic growth. And for that reason, we accept it at a slow and steady rate. We say that if we're getting a little bit of this inflation, it's actually a good sign because it means that we also get more output. Let's take a look at how this manifests on the diagram. So here is a short-run equilibrium where we could see aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. It creates an equilibrium price level and an output level in the short run. And now, let's say economic growth occurs. AD increases for any of those examples I just gave, or any other example you can come up with that would lead to an increase in C plus I plus G plus X minus M. You can see that the price levels have increased. That is the inflation. And also the output has increased, and that increase in output is considered, again, beneficial. That's why we'll allow this if it occurs at a slow and steady rate. It's favorable, let's say 2%. But maybe that inflation happens too quickly. Maybe it's happening at a rate of 5 or 6%, and prices are going out of control and consumers are suffering. How can we address it? There is a classical view which says that we can use supply-side policy to relieve inflationary pressure. And of course, the classical view says do that through free market supply-side policy, which we discussed in our classical presentation, which is cutting some of the regulations and some of the laws that are pro-labor or pro-citizens with the intention of making it cheaper to produce. And I think I have a diagram for you here. Here's a diagram of that. By doing those things, you could shift SRAS to the right. Again, here is the inflation, but by moving SRAS to the right, I can prevent price levels from increasing while still experience an increase in output. I'll show that one more time. Here's the initial demand pull. Here is the effect of supply-side policies. The problem with that is getting rid of those laws and regulations that in the first place were meant to help ordinary people. The alternative view is a Keynesian view, and the Keynesian view says use contractionary fiscal or monetary policy to slow the growth of AD. So keep letting AD grow. It would be foolish unless you are suffering from major inflation. It would be foolish to cut back on AD, but maybe slow the rate at which AD, where'd my mouse go? There it is. Slow the rate that AD goes from AD to AD1 to slow the rate of price levels increasing. Or you could also, if you go back to our Keynesian presentation, when the economy is very strong, then you might use interventionist supply-side policy, which is sometimes costly. For an evaluation, once again, I'll refer you to the Keynesian presentation, the pros and cons of contractionary fiscal or contractionary monetary policy. You need to be well versed in these for any macroeconomics question, but those would be the difference between the Keynesian and classical view. They see different strategies. One more time, I'll look at the diagrams. The Keynesian view would say slow the growth of AD to AD1 to slow the rate of inflation from going up. And the classical view would say to find ways to improve the supply side to keep price levels stable while increasing output, but the means by which that is done might not always seem helpful to ordinary people. So those are your two solutions from the classical and the Keynesian view. And again, you have to look at those previous presentations to really thoroughly understand those solutions to demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation is caused by an increase in the cost of factors of production, thus the name cost push. So as an example, if wages go up or resources become depleted, then the ability of firms to produce will decrease over time, and it's never acceptable because it comes with a decrease in output. So here is an equilibrium once again, and let's say the cost of factors of production go up. You could see SRAS would shift to the left to show that increase in the cost of factors of production, which would in turn lead to a decrease in the firm's ability to supply products throughout the nation. Price levels go up. Here's my mouse. There. Price levels are going up, and output is going down. So now you're dealing with those negatives of inflation, but also dealing with output decreasing. Thus, the claim that cost push inflation is not good. How do we address it? The classical view would be to use free market supply side policy to reduce the cost of factors of production. So if I look at that diagram again, I can move SRAS from SRAS1 back to SRAS, the original SRAS, and go to the original equilibrium. And by going to that original equilibrium, we'll have eliminated the initial cause of the cost push inflation. The Keynesians don't even really believe in this explanation for inflation, since they're demand side minded. They would really point to demand pull as the main cause of inflation. So if you're talking about correcting cost push inflation, the only reason you're discussing it in the first place is it's more of a classical view of inflation. So you really only need to explain and evaluate the classical solution to cost push inflation. Before we wrap up this presentation, we want to quickly look at good deflation and bad deflation. Remember earlier we talked about the problems of deflation. Those occur either way, whether it's good or bad deflation, such as it becoming more difficult to pay back long-term loans. But anyway, good deflation is caused by a reduction in the cost of factors of production. So it's the opposite of what we just saw with the cost push inflation. Good deflation is caused by an improvement in the supply side. And so here you could see the supply side is improving. It might occur naturally over time as technology becomes more efficient. Price levels are dropping. Output is going up. Really, it's a perfect situation. Of course, too much deflation isn't always good, but the increase in output is definitely advantageous. So we generally like this type of deflation when supply side improves. Typically, over time, AD will also shift to the right, so it's unlikely that you will get exactly the situation. But if AD were to shift to the right here, price levels would not be going up. You wouldn't have so much demand pull inflation as the factors of production are also improving. Bad deflation, though, is caused by a downturn in the economy. So bad deflation is just a different terminology for referring to a recession. So here we have AD decreasing. We've talked about this again in the Keynesian and classical presentations. Talk about it with cyclical unemployment. AD shifts to the left, price levels go down, there's the deflation, and output goes down from Y to Y1. That is definitely a concern. When output goes down, we're experiencing economic problems such as unemployment, and we know that less output can lead to unemployment, which can lead to less output, and it can start a deflationary cycle. So bad deflation is really just a recession. And you walk into an economics course thinking that inflation must be bad, deflation must be good, because a decrease in price levels means we can buy more, and an increase means we can buy less. But then as you actually evaluate the implications of inflation and deflation, you see that it's not that straightforward. In fact, deflation can be pretty costly to an economy. So that is a summary of inflation as well as deflation.